So this may be an apocryphal story, but it's said that when Jackson Pollock made his drips and splashes that he, quote, ended painting, unquote. Meaning painting had accomplished and examined all that it could possibly do. There was just nothing left to do. Problem was, there was a generation of young painters coming onto the scene, and they planned to continue painting. So if Pollock left them nothing to further consider, what would they do? Well, a young Jasper Johns painted targets, and flags, and maps, and other plain recognizable things. Johns earlier, from the mid to late 1950s, invented a new style that was coolly antithetical to the abstraction, expression, and gesture of the previous generation. While John's paintings extended the all-over compositional techniques of abstract expressionism, his use of these techniques stressed conscious control rather than that spontaneity of sort of letting paint fling and fly. So he painted flags. Or did he? This again seems to be a representational image, but maybe it is meant to signal the flatness or the relative lack of depth in much modernist painting. Remember how flat those Jackson Pollock canvas look. Maybe Johns is reminding us that it's a painted surface hanging on a wall, not a flag on a pole, as we're inclined to presume. The flag may function as an emblem of the United States, or maybe it represents American art. It could represent a historical thing, the vindictiveness of Senator Joseph McCartney, or the Vietnam War, or Afghanistan or Iraq today. Its meaning might depend on when Johns adopted the icon, or the date of our experience of it, or even the nationality of the viewer. It's also been suggested that the American flag in John's work is autobiographical. It's a reference because he was named after the Revolutionary War hero, Sergeant William Jasper, who was famed for raising the flag in a Confederate battle. Or the flag may mean none of these things. In other words, the meaning of the flag in John's art suggests the extent to which the meaning of any subject matter may be fluid and open to continual reinterpretation. This is my favorite Jasper Johns painting. It's in the permanent collection of the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and when I lived there, I used to visit it pretty much every time I went to the museum. It has a rich, magnificent surface, and that's the kind of thing you really can't appreciate when you're looking at a digital reproduction. In this way, it's like Pollock's paintings, right? In that it's a physical thing that delivers directly a meaning and a visual pleasure. But in this case, of course, it also has words, and like the targets and the maps, there's something to which we have already ascribed a meaning. And it has a painter's mixing stick glued right onto the canvas there in the upper right. What's going on with that? Even with a return to recognizable images, Johns intends meaning to be in the modes of image making, in the paint. Like a Pollock drip painting, these don't rely on the viewer interpreting a picture to find meaning. Remember, each viewer interpreted the meaning of the American flag long before they saw John's painting. But that the meaning is still in the act of making the painting. What Johns asserts is it doesn't matter if an image is recognizable or abstract. From now on, paintings would be seen as an expressive process, not a picture, even if we occasionally recognize something. So Johns begins to slowly introduce recognizable imagery into his paintings. And by the 1960s, he introduces much more. He and another artist, a friend of his named Robert Rauschenberg, begin a mode of art making known as combines, which really is just a rough-hew combination of painting and sculpture, right? Painting and objects. And of course, here we see Fool's House with an actual broom and a canvas stretcher, all sort of stuck right to the canvas itself. Here's Robert Rauschenberg's most famous combine, something called Monogram, which is a painting with a stuffed goat who happens to also be stuffed into a tire standing on it. So remember here, though, Duchamp's fountain, way back in 1917, I think it was, right, created an opportunity for artists to investigate whatever image making mode they could think of, right? Art could be anything you could imagine it to be. So imagine they did, right? It's really a foundational condition of this movement that's coming on now as known as postmodernism. Here's another famous early Rauschenberg artwork. This may not look like much because it doesn't look like there's really anything there. Well, not anymore, at least. This is a piece that Rauschenberg made called the Erased de Kooning drawing. And sure enough, that's what he did. All right. He visited de Kooning's studio, and de Kooning was really an artist who was an abstract expressionist and a generation sort of ahead of Rauschenberg. Rauschenberg met him while de Kooning was visiting the college where Rauschenberg was studying. And by 52, he was a leading figure, and Rauschenberg was just this like young kid coming out of art school. So he goes to de Kooning's studio in New York, and he asks him to give him a drawing that he can erase. And I've heard several stories about how this goes down. And one of them is that de Kooning thought it was a great idea and happily contributed. The other one was like de Kooning was not really happy about having one of his works ruined or destroyed, but after much cajoling, finally agreed to do so. In either event, for whatever reason, he decided he was going to give one to him that was going to be really, really hard to erase. And so it took several weeks for Rauschenberg to finally get everything off of the piece of paper. And it turns out that Jasper Johns himself was the one who sort of recognized the genius of it and framed it and titled it the Erased de Kooning drawing. But it's a perfect example of how these young artists took the ideas of abstract expressionists and really pushed them to define a new era known as postmodernism, right? And Erased de Kooning is really a perfect example of a postmodern work of art. And in that, three kind of main things. One, the art is in the action, right? The erasing, not the object, right? Obviously, he sort of destroys what used to be the art object, right? It makes it disappear. Two, it relies on a new mode of communication to make its art, right? It's an entirely new. I don't think anybody ever thought that erasing art was a way to make art. And of course, the value of this piece comes into question. Ideas about value, concepts about value. It was the import of a famous established artist, right? But that value is not absolute, right? It changes somehow. Maybe it gets more valuable, maybe it gets less, right? When Rauschenberg erases it. So postmodernism is really hard to define succinctly, but it really does have some consistent features. And one of them is relativism. Remember, what the abstract expressionist Barnett Newman said after World War II was, after the monstrosity of the war, what do we do? What is there to paint? We have to start all over again. Right? And that really reflects this idea that the doctrine of truth, knowledge, morality exists in relation to a culture or society, right? He's saying, look, everything's changed after World War II, right? It's not absolute, the things that we used to think, the things we used to do. We have to come up with new things. And remember, he went on to say that we're freeing ourselves of the impediments of memory, association, nostalgia, legend, and myth. That have been the devices of Western European painting, right? We're not doing that anymore. And think about those ideas in terms of John's American flag, right? It's freeing itself of its relationship to associations, to nostalgia, to legends, to American myths in that way. One of the next sort of major factors of postmodernism, it goes like this, right? In high school English, we all learn that simple definition of irony, right? It's opposite the intended meaning, right? So I'm going to say, I just love it when people don't wear masks and cough on me, right? Of course, I hate that, right? That's irony. It's opposite the intended meaning. And in many cases, there's a visual component of irony in postmodernism. And a very simple example is right here, where we see John's painting the word yellow in blue paint, which is literally the opposite color of yellow on the color wheel, right? So it's this kind of weird visual thing. You're reading yellow, but you're seeing blue. So it's sort of it puts that sort of meaning up in the air for you, right? It seems opposite its intention or its understood meaning. But again, in the broadest sense, irony in postmodern artworks, and this goes to all mediums, right? It's a rhetorical device in which what appears on the surface to be the case really does differ radically from what is actually the case, right? Even more broadly, what postmodernism does in visual art is it calls into question the veracity of surfaces and appearances, right? The surface looks like a flag, but is it, I presume, a meaning, but does it really mean that? No, this isn't a mistake. It's actually a reproduction of a painting you should now be familiar with from Abby Jacobson's podcast, right? This is a rendition of Blue Monochrome by Yves Klein, which he painted in 1961. And the meaning of this painting introduces our next characteristic of postmodernism. And think about that. Well, what does it mean? What does this painting mean to you? And I'd like you just for a second, like Questlove does in the podcast, just stare at it here for a minute. All right, well, that was more like 15 seconds or so, but you get the idea, right? Klein's blue monochromes, like Pollock's strip paintings again, are really just paint on a surface to be experienced directly. The experience of each viewer is going to be unique in that way, right? You see blue. I mean, what does blue mean, right? It's going to mean different things to different people, right? It's going to have a meaning that's utterly subjective, right? In fact, I would argue that when two viewers stand next to each other and look at it, two meanings coexist, and that's pluralism, right? The idea that a work of art can have a variety of meanings rather than just one meaning, right? And think about that. Like in the 1500s, when the Catholic Church commissioned a painter to depict, say, like the crucifixion of St. Peter, right? The church intended it to have pretty much the same meaning for everyone who saw it, right? And so art changes radically that way in postmodernism. Here are Yves Klein's living brush paintings, and these are the same kind that we saw in our video earlier. Now remember, a feature of the Enlightenment, and this happens in the 1700s, right around the founding of our own United States. A feature of the Enlightenment is the idea that there is an objective truth, or as Plato might call it, an ideal truth, right, that can be discovered through rational reasoning and the scientific method. And the progress of the human condition during this period in the West is really undeniable. But there was also a traumatic period for many ordinary people, right? They suffered because of industrialization. And of course, later they suffered in these massive, horrible world wars. So people lost their faith in this search for objective truths and for historical values and for orthodox morality. So they sought new explanations and they imagined a new world view. And that, of course, coincides with the advent of postmodernism. Now, think about the living brush paintings, right? Each is an image of a discrete person using that discrete person's actual body to apply the paint. These aren't mimetic expressions of the ideal human form, right? They're subjective, to be evaluated on their own terms. It's all about subjectivism, right? Which is really our next and final kind of idea about postmodernism, right? It's the doctrine that knowledge is merely subjective and that there is no external or objective truth, right? And we see that reflected throughout society after World War II, and of course reflected in the art that was made after that. So it really does continue to express the ideas and values of its time. And that brings us to pop art. You know, Johns and Rauschenberg are credited with influencing waves of art practice that emerged in this time in the 60s, including conceptual art, performance art, and of course, famously pop art. And next to Andy Warhol, Roy Lichtenstein is probably the most famous and recognizable pop artist, at least his work is. Lichtenstein referred to himself as a copyist. He freely admitted copying. And during the pop art period, he copied comic books. But remember, copying is the fundamental instinct of the artist, as we learned it going way back from the ancient Greeks. Right? It's the essence of mimesis. But Lichtenstein didn't really reproduce nature like the ancient Greek did. He reproduced culture. Right? In the simplest terms, he looked at a comic book and he painted it onto a canvas. In doing that, he took an inexpensive, mass-produced and mass-consumed item and reproduced it as an expensive fine art painting, like a rarefied object. And he didn't just copy it. He interpreted it too. He typically reduced the color palette to like really saturated primaries. He eliminated incidental details, heightened the contrast, and would emphasize and this is a quote of his, he would emphasize the pictorial cliches and graphic codes of commercially printed imagery, unquote. Here in one of his most famous paintings, Drowning Girl, for example, he cropped out most of the original scene and modified the statement in the text bubble, so he amplified that trope of the damsel in distress. Now, these paintings look simple, but if you look at it very closely, you'll see that they're actually very difficult and very challenging to make, because he would copy the source image by hand at first. And when he did that, he'd adjust it. So he'd draw out of the comic book just like we did when we were kids, right? And he'd adjust the composition to suit his narrative or his formal aims. And then he would trace the altered sketch onto a canvas, aided by a projector. So he'd project it onto the canvas and trace it. But then he did this crazy thing, right? He used a perforated template so that while he painted it onto the canvas, instead of just painting lines and fields of color, right, he would literally reproduce each of the dots that the printing process created, right? It was known that they were known as Ben-Day dots, not Ben-Gay dots. But that was how mechanical reproductions happened during the time. And so not only was it just sort of the image that he painted, but it was literally all the dots of the mechanical reproduction of that image that he painted in. So Lichtenstein isn't painting an image in a traditional way, right? He's painting the process by which commercial images and the comic books and newspapers, magazines, posters, billboards, everything, all of that stuff was printed that way back in those days. And you think about it, that's a subtle and it's a clever distinction, right? The reason pop art, and it's really the reason pop art becomes an important fine art movement in modern art history, right? Like Johns, Lichtenstein is dealt in images whose meanings were already settled, right? But he did so he could examine and critique the modern process of making images. I mean, or did he, right? That distinction may be lost on a great many who enjoy pop art today, because really to this day, Lichtenstein's work is immensely popular. If you go into gift shops and museums all over the United States, you'll see that they just sell the crap out of Lichtenstein's comic book imageries. It's all over the greeting cards, refrigerator magnets. I actually have a Lichtenstein refrigerator magnet, and tote bags and stuff like that. So that begs the question, is pop art a serious investigation and continuation into these radical ideas that Jackson Pollock and Jasper Johns were doing? Or is it really just rejecting them and returning to some sort of popular narrative style of image making? In that, I mean, is it a serious critique of our modern world of capitalism, an American hubris? Or is it just really part of it, right? Entrepreneurs looking to profit by creating popular consumer goods? Well, consider James Rosenquist's F-111. It's really widely considered to be one of the great pop art masterpieces. It's a painting of a life-sized F-111 nuclear fighter bomber. And at the time when it was made, the F-111 was regarded as the newest and the most technologically advanced warplane in the world. The F-111 stretches the entire length of the painting, and it's sort of overtaken in places by these giant images that are culled mostly from photographs and printed advertisements. Things like a wallpaper floral pattern, an angel food cake, a Firestone tire, light bulbs, canned spaghetti, a beach umbrella, my favorite really, a beach umbrella superimposed on an atomic blast. This is how the painting it looks today, where it's installed at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. So you can see that it's a massive, long series of panels that creates a single painting. It's important to notice, too, that the F-111 painting was really made in one of the most turbulent decades in U.S. history, this 1960. And Rosenquist understood that the mission of the actual F-111, and he saw it as a symbol of the military-industrial complex, that its mission was as much economic as it was military. It was meant to create jobs for Americans, support the country's gross national product, right? Support the American power, both economically and militarily. He characterized the image of the painting as, and I quote again, a plane flying through the flak of an economy, unquote. And it's funny because he saw the little girl under the hairdryer, that big metal hairdryer. He saw her as its pilot. There's an underwater diver that you probably saw in there, and he describes that in more ominous terms. And he thinks it's evocative of humans grasping for air during an atomic holocaust. So this is a graphic image, right? It's a graphic image of modern consumerism, so the double entendre really is intended there. Now, it's also interesting, this is an image of how it was originally installed in 1965. So it's interesting to note how F-111 was conceived to be presented, right? Rosenquist created it for his first solo show at New York City's Leo Castelli Gallery, one of the most famous galleries in the city at the time. The dimensions of its 59 interlocking panels were determined by the four walls of that space, which coincidentally also was determined by the size of the aircraft, right? So the work, once hung, would surround the enclosed viewer entirely. So think about that, right? You walk into this gallery and you would be surrounded by this, everywhere you look, you turn around and look, and there would be this giant, loud, shocking, continuous billboard-sized painting, right? Warplanes and consumer goods everywhere you looked, right? Was pop art meant to be a critique of popular culture? I mean, F-111 seems so, right? It seems determined to critique consumerism rather than profit from it. But profit it did. As Rosenquist's singular contribution to pop art, it actually made him one of the most famous and wealthy artists of his generation. But that's the thing about postmodernism, right? Everything means both things, right? Everything's done for more than one reason. Nothing's clear. And in that way, it's just like modern life. And no one, of course, really understood that better than the master of all pop artists, and really one of the most famous artists in the history of the United States, Andy Warhol. And so we'll talk about him next.